His name, carved in blood across history's scrolls. Madman? God? Or a storm even death could not silence. His sword devoured civilizations, yet victory starved his soul. He is Great Alexander. The night he was born, Olympus wept. Prophecies hailed him the Earthshaker, but none foresaw a crown of triumph forged as chains. Every word he learned as a boy became an epitaph for kingdoms. I crushed Persia to dust, became a god in Egypt, drowned the Ganges in crimson. But each conquest tore fragments from my spirit. Ask yourselves, was it glory I sought, or my own annihilation? My greatest enemy, not war, not greed, my own reflection. Every mirror hissed, more, until the void choked my voice. Remember, every legend wears the mask of tragedy. This is the tale of a mortal even gods envied. Are you ready to hear Alexander's final roar? Olympias, a queen consumed by mystic fire and unyielding ambition. Her very name echoed through the halls of Macedonia like a whispered curse. Legend tells of a night drenched in storm and shadow, when a serpent, said to be Zeus himself in disguise, slithered into her chambers, binding her in a coil of divine seduction. From this unholy union, a child was conceived, destined to burn the world with his fury. On the night of his birth, the earth itself trembled. Persepolis, the glittering jewel of Persia, shook to its foundations. Temple priests, their voices choked with dread, prophesied, "A storm walks among mortals, a conqueror who will make empires kneel." King Philiph watched his son with a heart poisoned by suspicion. Alexander was no ordinary heir. He was a creature forged by Olympias's whispered lies of godhood. His soul fed on the fire of Homer's wars. At 13, when the boy was sent to Aristotle's remote sanctuary of learning, the philosopher saw both brilliance and ruin in his eyes. Under the gnarled olive trees of Mieza, Aristotle warned, "Beware the hunger of kings, Alexander. Men may bow to your sword, but only wisdom, cold, unyielding wisdom, will spare you from becoming a tyrant history reviles." But fate, as ever, laughed at mortal plans. In 336 BC, at a wedding meant to unite kingdoms, the air thick with wine and treachery, Philip II fell, a dagger plunged into his heart by a shadow. As the king gasped his last, the court erupted in chaos. Servants fled, nobles traded accusing glances, and somewhere in the palace, Olympia smiled. The question hissed through corridors like venom. Who wielded the blade? A pawn, or the queen herself? And so, at just 20 summers old, Alexander stood atop a precipice. The crown of Macedonia, still slick with his father's blood, weighed heavy on his brow. Before him knelt generals hardened by war, men who had fought beside Philip, men who doubted this fiery youth. Yet when Alexander spoke, his voice carried the thunder of a coming tempest. "You think this crown is power? It is a shackle. From this day, I carve my destiny not in gold, but in the bones of nations. Where the sky meets the earth, there my empire ends." The dawn of an empire. And so, at just 20 years old, Alexander stood upon the precipice of history. The weight of his father's crown pressed against his brow, but it was not the weight of duty he felt. It was the weight of expectation, of prophecy, of an unshakable destiny. The war-hardened generals before him, men who had bled beside Philip, bent the knee in reluctant allegiance. They saw not a boy, nor merely a king, but a storm waiting to break. They knew the truth before he even spoke it. Alexander was never meant to simply rule. He was meant to carve his name into eternity. With eyes blazing like the sun on a battlefield, he lifted the blood-stained crown higher, his voice thundering through the marble halls. "This crown is not my cage. It is my weapon. It is not the end of ambition, but its spark. From this moment forward, no border will contain me. No kingdom will defy me. Every land kissed by the heavens, every mountain, river, and sea that dares to meet the sky, shall bow to my will." The room stood silent for a breath. Then the air itself seemed to tremble with the unspoken truth. This was no ordinary king. This was something else entirely. Alexander no longer sought to rule only Macedonia. His vision burned beyond its borders. The sprawling lands of Persia, the distant riches of Egypt, the fabled kingdoms hidden beyond the horizon, all of them called to him like whispers in the wind. He was not just a sovereign, he was a force of nature, an unrelenting tide set to drown the world in conquest. But a throne is never truly claimed. It must be fought fought for, taken with steel and fire. Before Alexander could seize his destiny, he had to prove himself worthy of it. He had to silence his doubters, crush his enemies, and make the world kneel in reverence or in terror, and there was only one way to do that. This story would not be written with treaties or words of peace, but with the clash of swords, the screams of the fallen, and rivers of blood. Granicus War, spring 334 BC. A young king steps onto Anatolian soil to challenge an immortal empire. Alexander's army, 35,000 strong, forged by his father, faced Persia's elite cavalry and mercenaries. The Persian generals had massed 20,000 horsemen and 10,000 infantry along the riverbank. But Alexander did not attack at night, as they expected. He did not starve them into fatigue. Instead, he did the unthinkable. He struck at the height of their strength and dared death itself. As historian Arian wrote, "The Persians expected the Macedonians to cross at dawn, but Alexander caught them unprepared with a suicidal charge." The battlefield swiftly turned into a slaughterhouse. The river churned with hooves and screams. Persian cavalry tried to pin the Macedonians midstream, but Alexander's steel nerves and genius turned the tide. Then, Persian commander Mithridates locked eyes with Alexander, his blade hungry for glory. He raised his sword. One strike would end the legend. But in that heartbeat, Clitus, Alexander's most loyal general, severed Mithridates' arm in a single stroke. As Diodorus recounted, when Alexander's spear pierced the enemy's heart, the Granicus ran red. That was the moment the Persians realized they'd lost. This was no ordinary victory. Granicus marked the birth of a legend. Persian commanders now saw Alexander's ruthless brilliance and would never underestimate him again. But more importantly, Alexander's men now believed in him utterly. A king who defied death, leading fearless soldiers, could rewrite history, and Alexander was just getting started. Alexander say, "The riches of Asia will be ours, but the greatest treasure is your faith in me." History rewards the bold, but sometimes, fate itself lays an unsolvable knot at one's feet. And in that moment, the answer is not patience, it's the edge of a blade. 33 BC, Gordian, the ancient capital of Phrygia. Legend tells of Gordius, a humble farmer chosen by the gods to rule as king. The knot he tied to his chariot was so intricate, no mortal could unravel it. The prophecy was clear. Whoever unties the Gordian knot shall rule all Asia. And now, that prophecy stood before Alexander. Alexander traced the knot's coils. His fingers probed its gaps, searching for a hidden weakness. But the ropes, hardened by time, resisted. He paused. Then, a spark ignited in his eyes. There is more than one way to conquer a knot. In a flash, his sword was drawn. Alexander did not unravel the knot. He sundered it. The crowd gaped. The priests murmured. The gods have chosen him. And that night, the heavens roared their approval. 333 BC. The plains of Issus would soon witness history. On one side, the young and unstoppable Alexander. On the other, the ruler of the East, King Darius III. The Persian army was enormous, 100,000 soldiers, war elephants, elite guards. But was victory always about numbers? Darius said sarcastically. This boy dares to challenge the Persian Empire? He is only a passing storm. But Alexander was not a storm. He was a hurricane. Alexander struck directly at the heart of the enemy. He trapped the Persians in a narrow passage where numbers meant nothing. Macedonian spears tore through the Persian lines, and then Alexander made his move. Straight at Darius himself. Darius cried out, furious this time. "No, this can't be happening." One of the most powerful rulers in history had just fled from battle. Seeing their king flee, his army scattered before the legend that stood before them. But Alexander did not win only through conquest. He refused to harm his enemy's family. He treated them as his own family. As Plutarch wrote, he conquered not only with his sword, but also with his mercy. A god is born in Egypt. A 300-kilometer march through the unforgiving desert. The sun scorched their skin, the sandstorms blinded their eyes, and the unrelenting thirst threatened to break their spirits. Camels collapsed from exhaustion, soldiers whispered doubts. But Alexander never faltered. He pressed forward, driven by something greater than mere conquest, destiny itself. Finally, after weeks of suffering, he reached his destination, the Siwa oasis. There, hidden among palm trees and crystal-clear springs, lay the sacred oracle of Amun, a temple of the gods older than time itself.
As he stepped through its ancient gates, the priests knelt before him, their eyes filled with awe. This was no ordinary man before them. He had crossed the impossible, defied the wrath of the desert, and arrived at the house of the gods. Was he truly mortal? The priest speaks in a deep, reverent voice. You are the son of Zeus. In that moment, Alexander was no longer just a king. He was divine. The oracle of Amun had spoken. Egypt did not see him as a mere conqueror. To them, he was a god king, the rightful ruler sent by the heavens. But Alexander's ambitions stretched far beyond divine titles. He had no interest in simply ruling Egypt. He wanted to reshape the world. And so, he envisioned a city unlike any other. A city that would be the crown jewel of civilization, standing as a beacon of knowledge, trade, and power for centuries to come. He called it Alexandria. He ordered the city to be built at the mouth of the Nile, where the land kissed the sea. Its streets would be wide and straight, its buildings grand and majestic. But above all, two wonders would define it. The first was the Great Library of Alexandria, a sanctuary of knowledge that would house over 700,000 scrolls containing the wisdom of the world. Scholars from every land would gather here, sharing ideas, preserving history, and unlocking the mysteries of the universe. The second was the Pharaohs of Alexandria, a lighthouse 130 meters tall, its fire visible for miles across the sea. Sailors would navigate by its light, and it would stand as a symbol of human ingenuity, guiding travelers to the greatest city on earth. As Alexander looked upon the land where his dream would rise, he spoke with unwavering conviction. Alexander spoke with determination. This city will make my name immortal. And so, with the sands of Egypt beneath his feet and the favor of the gods behind him, Alexander took his first step toward eternity. 331 BCE, in the northern lands of Mesopotamia, on the vast plains of Gaugamela, one of the greatest battles in history was about to unfold. This was not just a clash of two armies, it was a battle between two civilizations. The ruler of the East, Darius, sought revenge for his humiliating defeat at Issus. This time, he assembled an unprecedented force, 200,000 soldiers, 15,000 cavalry, 200 scythe chariots, and 50 towering war elephants. The Persian army had carefully prepared the battlefield, flattening the terrain to maximize the effectiveness of their chariots and cavalry. Alexander's generals were deeply concerned. The enemy had both numerical and tactical advantages. But Alexander, calm and composed, studied the battlefield one last time. Then, looking straight into the eyes of his commanders, he declared, "They may outnumber us, but we are the ones who carry the spirit of time, and that spirit fights by our side." As the Persian forces charged, Alexander made a bold maneuver. He positioned his troops at an angled formation, luring the enemy to expose their center. By the fourth hour of battle, Alexander and his companion cavalry spotted a gap and struck like lightning. Then, with a sudden change of course, they charged straight toward Darius's royal chariot. The battlefield trembled as swords clashed and battle cries filled the air. Blood soaked the dry earth. Darius, caught off guard by the speed of Alexander's assault, panicked. In a desperate bid to escape, he climbed into his royal chariot and fled the battlefield. And in that moment, the Persian army began to collapse. Alexander called out victoriously, "Run, Darius. Never forget, the world belongs to me now." With this victory, the heart of the Persian Empire had been shattered. The road to the east lay open. Soon, the grand city of Persepolis would fall into Alexander's hands. But even as he stood victorious, his mind was restless. One thought haunted him. Darius was still alive. And so, on that fateful night, fire consumed Persepolis. But historians still debate, was this an act of rage, or was Alexander exacting vengeance for Troy? After all, centuries ago, the Persians had burned Greek lands to the ground. Now, history had come full circle. Sometimes a king is remembered not only for his victories, but for the cities he left in ashes. Blood and storm. The Indian Campaign. Alexander and his army were melting away under the poisonous rains of India. The relentless monsoon drenched their bodies, soaking through armor and clothing alike. The soldiers, already weary from months of grueling marches and fierce battles, were plagued by hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Yet, for Alexander, conquest was not merely a goal. It was the very essence of his existence. His desire for glory and dominance transcended the hardships they faced, and retreat was never an option in his mind. Turning back was an admission of failure, and failure was a word that had no place in his vocabulary. Ahead of them, a new and formidable enemy lay in wait. King Porus, a ruler whose kingdom stretched along the banks of the river Hydaspes, and his mighty war elephants, massive creatures that towered over men and horses alike. These beasts, armored in metal, were an ancient symbol of power and strength, and their very presence seemed to defy the laws of nature. The battlefield before Alexander was a storm of chaos, and in the heart of it, the elephants seemed to carry the weight of an entire civilization on their backs. As the battle unfolded, the earth itself seemed to tremble with each step the war elephants took. Their heavy bodies pounded the ground, creating shockwaves that spread through the Macedonian ranks. The soldiers, who had once been a proud and disciplined force, found themselves disoriented, caught off guard by the sheer power of this new foe. The Macedonian lines surged forward, desperate to break the enemy's formation, but they were met with a deadly rain of arrows from the Indian archers high above. These projectiles, seemingly endless, fell like a storm of death upon the Macedonian warriors, piercing shields, armor, and flesh alike. Horses screamed in terror, thrashing wildly as their riders struggled to regain control. Shields shattered in an instant, leaving the soldiers vulnerable and exposed to the brutal onslaught. And then, in the midst of the chaos and destruction, the unthinkable happened. Cephalus, Alexander's legendary horse, fell to the ground. The mighty steed, who had carried Alexander through battles from Greece to Persia, from Egypt to India, lay dying on the blood-soaked earth of the battlefield. In that moment, the very symbol of Alexander's strength and invincibility crumbled beneath him. For the first time in his life, Alexander saw fear in the eyes of his soldiers. The unshakable resolve that had carried them through so many battles had faltered. They were no longer marching forward with the hope of victory. They were marching toward their inevitable graves. The fear was palpable, a silent epidemic that spread throughout the ranks. The Macedonian army, once an unstoppable force, now found itself at a crossroads. Faced with the stark reality of defeat, Alexander had no choice. His indomitable will was shaken, and he turned back, the first time he had ever retreated in his entire career. This retreat, this moment of humility, marked the beginning of the end for Alexander the Great. It signaled the start of his final journey, one that would ultimately lead him to the distant shores of Babylon, where he would face a new set of challenges, both external and internal. The Indian campaign, which had once seemed like another triumph in the making, had come to a tragic end. The land of India, with its warriors, elephants, and fierce independence, had humbled the greatest conqueror the world had ever known. But even in retreat, Alexander would not be forgotten. His legend would live on, not as a tale of invincibility, but as a story of ambition, struggle, and the fragile nature of greatness. Babylon, the last stop for the man who, in his youth, seemed destined to rule all the earth. A city that once reverberated with the sounds of triumph now stands witness to his fading pulse. His body, ravaged by illness, seems almost as though it is a mere shadow of the mighty ruler he once was. But what had truly brought him here? Poison? Malaria? Or was it simply the toll of a life spent relentlessly chasing conquest, battling through the sands of time? He was only 32 years old, but the weight of 1,000 battles and a ceaseless thirst for power had aged him beyond his years. How could a man who had never known defeat on the battlefield succumb to this? To death, a cruel, invisible enemy that no sword could vanquish. As his generals gathered around him, their faces etched with concern, they asked him the question that would define the future of his empire. To whom do you leave your empire, O king? Alexander faint, almost inaudible, to the strongest narrator. With these 3 words, Alexander sealed the fate of his empire. A man who had conquered all that lay before him, yet could not conquer the inevitable. And so, the greatest empire the world had ever known was left with no heir to its throne. No successor. No peace. And so the man who marched to the very edge of the world reached the final boundary. Death. But in his wake, he left nothing but turmoil. No heir, no vision. Only war, bloodshed, and division, as the empire that spanned continents began to crumble, and the dream of unity dissolved into 1,000 warring factions. The dream of an empire built by one man had been buried beneath the rubble of his passing.